we'll see some more about this in a minute, but yeah, I put these in the front because they're iconic and beautiful. Now, so where do fungi fit? Let's really step back. Where do they fit in the tree of life? I've kind of gotten a little bit away from talking about, the 5 kingdoms or the 7 kingdoms. There's 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have nuclei, and the fungi are, one of many kingdoms, if you want to call them that, well-defined groups within the nucleated cell group that includes us, animals, and plants, but also includes a lot of other things like amoebas and slime molds and so on that are very different, but are sometimes confused with fungi. More about that in a minute. So what makes a fungus a fungus?
That's good enough.
Sure.
First of all, they have nuclei, as I mentioned, so they're eukaryotes, and their cell walls contain chitin, which makes them fairly unique among many cell types. But chitin is also found in the exoskeletons of insects, for example. Certainly makes it different from us, meaning animals, humans, and other animals, other mammals anyway. And they, unlike us, they obtain their nutrients by dissolving stuff right outside of them. So they secrete a bunch of enzymes that turn whatever's out there into digestible food. Unlike us, for example, because we eat it and we digest it inside of us. And unlike like many of other life forms with which we are all familiar, they move by growing. That's really their only option. They can't move. They can't run towards their food. They don't have flagella or anything like that. So they can just grow towards their food, and they're very efficient at probing their environment to find nutrients. But each time they have to grow another cell. The basic unit of it is the hyphus, and they just keep on growing. And then sometimes they stop growing and dissolve and move in a different direction and change resources. But that's how they move. Alternatively, if they're a spore, for example, they can move by passive transport, or if they're eaten by a slug or something, parts of them can, including spores, can be moved elsewhere by that mechanism, which they take advantage of. But that makes them different from other life forms. And the major difference, just again, big picture here, is where they stand in the food chain. But fungi, unlike plants, which are called autotrophs, which make their own complex carbohydrates using the energy of the sun, and starting with carbon dioxide. We all know this, but they make carbs. And fungi, they can't make their own carbs generally, not for food, not complex carbs. So, and neither can we. So that makes us similar to fungi. We're heterotrophs. So we need to find a source of carbs, generally from plants. And so we eat them. We eat plants. And we either eat plants directly, like a fungus, including us. We either eat a plant directly, or we eat something that ate a plant. Or you can even imagine, them being tertiary consumers, like a fungus eating the dung of a carnivore who ate a deer, which is an herbivore, which ate a plant. So, but ultimately, all the carbs come from the plants. So that's why the fungi are grouped with us, along with jellyfish, and I guess this is a praying mantis and a worm, you know, animals. But also many bacteria fall in this category. So that's the basic dichotomy, autotrophs versus heterotrophs. But I mean, just narrowing down further, let's define what is a mushroom, because I find this is often confusing. Well, a mushroom is also known as a fruit body or a sporocarp to mycologists. So it's a subset of fungi. It's a structure that you can see with your eyes, classically with a cap and stem, but it's not limited to that now by most definitions. And it's a structure built to facilitate sexual reproduction. And fungal sex is very complicated, and it doesn't really compute in human terms. And I'm not really going to get into that. But the structure is built to generate and disperse spores. I mean, that's why mushrooms exist. And my definition, and most people's modern definitions, includes fruit bodies that also, they don't limit it to those with a cap and a stem, but also those who don't have a stem, but you can see, and they're big and have spores. And they may not have gills or pores, but they may even be underground, like truffles, which are just big containers for spores. You may not even be able to see them unless you dig them up. And there's an enormous number of truffles, but they're out of sight, out of mind. That we just don't see them because they're underground. You know, a few we can smell, but most not. And then I also would include among mushrooms toadstools. The old literature would divide mushrooms would be the edible sporocarps and toadstools would be the poisonous ones, but they're all mushrooms to me. A big point to note here is that the fungi that make mushrooms are only a small subset of the millions of fungal species that are present on the planet, the vast majority of which haven't been characterized and don't even have names. So most of the things we call mushrooms, the fungi that make these big visible sporocarps, containers for spores, fall within the subkingdom of Dicaria, meaning they have two nuclei. This is a characteristic of them. At some point in the life, instead of like us only having one nucleus in a cell at a time, they have two. Sometimes they've been called higher fungi, but that's fallen out of favor because I don't know what's higher, what's lower. I mean, some fungi have been around for billions of years and are exquisitely good at what they do, but they don't make mushrooms. So most of members of this subkingdom are in the so-called Ascomycota. The so-called ascos. There are two major divisions, the ascos and the basidios. There are at least 60,000 named species, and they include the fungi that have cups. We'll see some of these. Other familiar mushrooms, morels, truffles, brewers and baker's yeast, ergot, you know, the fungus that infects grains, cereal grains, and is blamed for the Salem, you know, the outbreak of madness associated with that led to the Salem witch trials and so on. Powdery mildews, and most lichens. There are an enormous number of lichens in this world which form partners with other life forms, but most of those are ascos. And then the basidios, and they include the agarics, which are the guild mushrooms. All right, so they're the most familiar to us. The boletes, which are many of the pored mushrooms, puffballs, earth stars. I'll show you an example of the stinkhorns, the ones that attract flies, conchs, the ones that are tough, woody shelf fungi, jelly fungi, smuts and rusts, and so on. So there are all kinds of these.
Is in powdery mildew are different than the smuts and rusts.
Yeah, huh. That's interesting.
Yeah, and some of these actually at one point were gilled and then gave up that lifestyle to become, and so on. They go back and forth. It's actually quite fascinating when you start looking at the phylogeny of the evolution of these things. Anyway, my bottom line here is that almost all mushrooms are ascos or basidios, but most ascos and basidios are not mushrooms. Again, stressing that there's a universe of fungi out there, a small subset of which form what we recognize as mushrooms. All right, so what is not a mushroom? Well, many yeasts, smuts, mildews, and molds, some of them actually just reproduce asexually constantly and don't produce fruiting bodies. Most famous example is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That's brewer's yeast and baker's yeast, that makes beer and makes bread rise and so on. There are various strains of this, but they're all the same, considered to be the same species. Lichens are not considered to be mushrooms because they don't make these large fruiting bodies, but they do make small fruiting bodies. I think I have a picture of that. But the thing about lichens is that they're actually partnerships with algae or cyanobacteria that can use the energy of sunlight to make carbs. Then there's slime molds. I'll show you a couple of examples of these, but they're often mistaken for mushrooms, and they were called molds, but they're not fungi. They're really quite different genetically and in lifestyle, and they're generally called myxomycetes. And then the water molds, very important to us. They're called oomycetes, because it includes Phytophthora ramorum, which is the sudden oak death syndrome agent. And a very similar organism, Phytophthora infestans, caused the potato famine and millions of deaths secondary to that in Ireland, or at least 1 million deaths. So very important organisms, but they're not fungi, and they're definitely not mushrooms. So what are their role in ecosystems, staying on the big picture? Well, I mean, they have the classic association with death and decay, but all that has changed, especially over the past 20 years. But their role in death and decay is very important. If you can imagine, if nothing ever decayed in the forest, I mean, pretty soon you wouldn't have a forest because you wouldn't get nutrient recycling. But they've also now are recognized to play a big role in the sharing of nutrients between things that are not even fungi, like sharing of nutrients between trees and even between trees that are plants that are different species. So they've now recognized, this is where a lot of the research is happening, the most exciting research in mycology. They're partnerships in forest ecology and maintenance of forest health. And in that regard, they play a variety of roles which you can parse out, but saprobic, which means, digesting dead stuff, parasitic or pathogenic, some of them actually, are harming their hosts, maybe not killing them. And some of them actually kill their hosts while digesting them. We know about that. And we could be talking about plants here in the forest, or we could be talking about us. We're prey to a variety of fungal diseases. But maybe the more interesting ones are mutualistic or commensal. Lichens were one example that I mentioned. Some people have been likened that to enslavement, but the algae or cyanobacteria partner gets something out of it. They get they get protection from the sun's rays, from cold, and from being eaten by other organisms. Mycorrhizal relationships are the ones that are the most actively being investigated now. And they fall into the categories of arbuscular, ericoid, and ecto. More about this in a minute, but 80% of vascular plants are thought to have arbuscular partnerships with mycorrhizal fungi, which help them grow. And I'll show you some examples of this in a minute, why this is helpful. But our big trees too, and the ones that produce mushrooms, like the ones I showed you in the beginning, those are ectomycorrhizal fungi. They form a relationship with the roots of specific trees. And it's a two-way deal. The trees provide the mushrooms with carbs, basically. And the mushrooms provide the trees with micronutrients like phosphorus and also water, and provide protection from, sort of like a protection racket, from other things that might kill them. And they provide connections between young and old trees and other plants. Of course, fungi, excuse me while I take a drink, are also food. They're food for a variety of plants. I'll discuss a couple of examples. Some of these are called microheterotrophs. They're plants that actually have lost the ability to make chlorophyll and to make their carbohydrates using the energy of sunlight. Instead, they tie into the mycorrhizal fungi and steal the carbs, which they in turn took from the trees and other plants that they have mycorrhizal associations with. And then many animals eat fungi, including gnats. Some of them actually farm them. And these are very important on a global scale. Ants, termites, humans. Ants, I mean, I'm sure you've heard about this, but leaf-cutting ants, many types of ants actually farm fungi underground. And fungi, that's what they eat. Termites, same deal. They farm them. And when a termite mound dies, you see the fruiting body come out of the mushroom. I've actually eaten one of those. It was delicious. They're called termitomyces. And of course, we eat fungi, and other fungi eat fungi. Those relationships can become quite predatory. So let's look specifically at one type of mycorrhizal structure, the so-called ectomycorrhizal structure. So here's a pine tree, a young pine tree with a little root. And it, you can imagine how big it is. But most of what you can see here is actually an ectomycorrhizal fungus, a mushroom actually that forms a fruiting body. And they can extend the reach of the roots because they're connected to the roots by about 200. They can go beyond the roots by about 200 times the distance. And they're much, much finer than roots. And you can see what they might add to the roots. Water, nutrients, they have other capabilities that roots lack, like breaking down soil and rock and acquiring phosphate and other essential nutrients. So that's why it's a two-way partnership that's actually thought to be very old, at least 500 million years old, and possibly existed at the time when plants first colonized land. And the connections between the mycorrhizal fungi and the roots are intimate. They're not haphazard. They form mantles, very organized mantles around the root tips. They actually penetrate through and around the roots. It's not subtle. It's very organized. And the other types of mycorrhizal fungi have different relationships, some of which the arbuscular mycorrhizal ones that are very prominent in vascular plants actually penetrate inside of the cells of the roots. And as we have exported our trees, like Pinus radiata, which is the Monterey pine, all over the world, it's in plantations all over the world, we've also found that they grow better with our fungi. So we have exported our ectomycorrhizal fungi that are associated with that tree. So they're very important. It's led to the concept of the wood wide web, where mycorrhizal fungi of various sorts connect, mushrooms to tree roots and tree roots to tree roots, big trees to little trees, dying trees to young trees, plants of the same species to plants of different species, and so on and so on. The relationships are very complex, and I am not going to go into them. But it's an amazing variety of arrangements, and apparently extremely important to life on Earth. Just an aside here, with some local nods about mushrooms and mycelia as food. Here's a photo I took from Huddard Park of a banana slug eating an oyster mushroom. You must have seen this before. I mean, banana slugs love oyster mushrooms, and we do have a lot of oyster mushrooms because of all of our dying oaks. But also there's some unusual relationships like fungus gnats. These are very small type of fly that from several different species that like to eat, their larvae like to eat the mycelium of fungus underground, and they sometimes land on fungi, but they are thought to play a role in spreading the spores of our, what is it called?
You know what? We're not going to see it anyway because we eat it.
Do you know the plant called the fetid adder's tongue? Which you can see in Huddard Park. It's locally common, but especially along Richards Road, but not, it's not common in general. And anyway, these fungus gnats are attracted to the fetid adder's tongue, which smells to them apparently like a mushroom. So anyway, it's interesting. And then there are other mushrooms, other plants, like this striped coral root that you can see in Huddard and Wunderlich, which is an achlorophorous plant. So it doesn't have chlorophyll. So, but it ties into generally Russula mushrooms that are underneath the mycelium of Russula mushrooms that are underneath the ground. And that's where it gets its carbs. Can't make its own. And the russulas, of course, in turn get it from a tree. So that's what we call mycoheterotrophy. So a plant that gets its food from a mushroom. How do we distinguish one mushroom from another? Well, obviously the spore dispersing structure, the mushroom itself. So where is it? Is it under the ground like a truffle? Is it on the ground, terrestrial? Is it above the ground? Is it on a tree? What's it growing on? What's its growth habit? Is it just one mushroom? Is it a cluster of mushrooms? Does it troop? Does it form a shelf on a tree or a ring like the fairy rings that our fairy ring mushrooms form? And then for the things that you can see with your eyes, the macroscopic features, do they have gills, veins, tubes, teeth, cups? And what's the color of their spores? And also the mycologists use all of their sensory capabilities. So, what does a mushroom smell like? Sometimes you can smell a mushroom before you can see it. And many mycologists will take a small taste of a mushroom in the field to try to identify it because they may otherwise look very similar, but is it bitter or what? And its texture, velvety, hairy, woody, slimy, etc. And then you can get closer to identifying mushrooms to species based on the shape of their spores, their size, and how they're packaged in an ascus or a basidium. This is what ascos versus basos means. But this is, you need a microscope for that. And there are a lot of mushrooms you really can't tell apart without a microscope. And then what is their substrate? So when you're talking about, you're trying to say, tell somebody, well, I saw this mushroom. What is it? Well, what's it growing on? Because it's very telling. Is it dung? Very specific mushrooms grow on dung. Is it coming just out of dirt? Well, under what kind of tree? What kind of dirt? Redwood duff, for example, they're coming off of wood, growing on wood. Well, okay, is it on the bark or is it on the sapwood? On a pine cone? Is it on a leaf? Or is it coming out of an insect? Cordyceps, they're famous for that. The ones that turn insects into zombies. And does it have a partner? Is it, if it's a mycorrhizal fungus, the tree that it's growing under is very important. Or if it's growing on, is it growing under grass or wood chips, or is it growing off of another fungus? These are all important. And then seasonality is important too, because some mushrooms we basically never see at certain times of the year. And they do vary quite a bit. And here in our Mediterranean climate, of course, we see most of our mushrooms during the wet season, but some precede the wet season or follow it. So that also is important. And then in the modern era, the DNA is like the final arbiter, and more amateur mycologists collect a mushroom and send it off to be sequenced. And then they know. And it is possible these days for an amateur mycologist to find a mushroom that has never been named or identified before, including in our area. I've been on expeditions where that's happened. Basic mushroom anatomy here. Well, this is what we call the cap. That's obvious. Mushrooms, mycologists often call it a pileus. Many mushrooms, but not all, have a cup at the base, which is also called a vulva. This is my daughter acting as a hand model here. And then this is obviously the stem, but then they often have little root-like projections. They're not roots, they're like roots. Rhizo means root, of course, so they look like roots. They're really thickened area of the mycelium. And sometimes you see the mycelium itself, which are very fine hairs coming off the bottom, and you recognize what the color is. Here, we're looking at the other features. The spore-producing part of the mushroom is called the hymenium, and it may have gills, it may have pores, ridges, teeth. It's very important to see that. I so often people send me a picture of a mushroom and they don't show me what the bottom looks like. And that's really tough, which is to say almost impossible. Many mushrooms, but not all, have a ring, which is part of the veil or the covering which covered the spore-bearing surface initially, and it often slides down the stem or stipe of the mushroom. But many don't have one, and that too is very important to note, important feature. And then there's the base of the stem or the bulb, which can be varying shaped or bent or turnip-like or club-like. There's a lot of descriptors. This mushroom here, which I've chosen to be our mushroom spokesmodel, is Agaricus hondensis, which is named after La Honda. Was first identified locally, or nearby us. It's called the felt-ringed agaricus. It's probably our most common agaricus mushroom in Huddard and Wunderlich parks for sure in the winter. And it's very similar, closely related to the button mushroom, which is why it probably looks familiar, that's in the grocery stores. But it's not good to eat. And it smells like phenol, like a chemical, not like something edible. Often gets a little yellow in the base of the stem. I don't know if you can see it. Anyway, very, very common mushroom here. Here's another one. This actually came from Hubbard Park, but it's a different species. It's Agaricus xanthodermus, the so-called yellow staining agaricus. I hope you can see the yellow staining if you scratch the surface. Otherwise, it looks like a lot like a button mushroom. It's still an agaricus genus, but these two mushrooms are the same species. In fact, they were growing out of the same cluster. What I wanted to point out was that this mushroom was hiding under this one. This one has been shaded and is young. This one has been exposed to the sun, and it's basically started producing melanin. So mushrooms can look very different after they're exposed and as they age. And you have to identify them, you have to learn their differences with time and conditions. Similarly, I'm showing this in this one place example of the king bolete, which is a prized edible around the world. Goes by different names. It's the porcini. These are the porcini that you find in the store, prized in Italy, but also many other places. We have our own version here, but these two were essentially right next to each other. They came from the watershed, San Francisco watershed, very near Hubbard, just north of Filoli, on one of our collecting expeditions there. And this one was shaded and this one was in the sun. So you see the differences. Spore prints, spore color. Some mushrooms produce abundant spores, like this common mushroom in wood chips around here called the mulch maid, Loradiomyces percivalii. You could sit this down for 3 minutes and you'd get that spore print. An hour gets you this one. But spores are many different colors, and their color is a characteristic feature, and it's one way, an important way to tell them apart. Unfortunately, it's hard to do that in the field, but you can get a sense of what the spores colors are in some cases. Like here's our common Western artist conch, Ganoderma brownii. In this case, it's on a black acacia, but the coloration at the base are spores. In fact, the spores have even gone up and colored the top of the mushroom body. These produce billions and trillions of spores. They're just amazing spore producers. And they also can live a very long time. Each layer here is a year. So you can see 50-year-old artist conchs. And so I never collect them because it takes too long to grow them. And the thing is, on the trees that they grow on, and in our area, most commonly, it's the bay laurel. They don't generally kill the tree. They seem to coexist with it, often for decades, which is why they're so old. The tree, though, can outlive the fungus. Here's one example from Woodside. Actually, it's from my property, because I've been following this one for 20 years. And the Ganoderma, the artist conch, finally died, stopped fruiting. So this is a bay laurel. So the bay laurel won in this case. But usually they just coexist. Very common. Other ways to see the spore color, very characteristic. There are many species of Cortinarius in our area. Other known as quartz or web caps, some of which are not yet characterized. They're almost always mycorrhizal, so they grow in a specific association with trees. But but they're almost all of them make orange, sort of rust-colored spores. And you can see them collected here, and I've blown it up. So the reason you can see that, this is the remnants of the partial veil on the mushroom, is because the spores have landed on it and it's sticky. So you can get clues about spore color that way, and it's very good for identifying Cortinarius, which are otherwise actually sometimes quite challenging and very challenging to identify by species. I thought I'd mention something about deadly mushrooms. Actually, thankfully this year, at least I've seen very few of these death caps, but they're the most famous ones and deservedly so. They they form mycorrhizal relationships with especially our coast live oaks. And at times, and in certain years, they're very common. They are a fungal weed. They were introduced from Europe. This has been very clearly established, probably on nursery stock. And they have the characteristic very exuberant cup or vulva, a big ring. When fresh, they have kind of an olive to green complexion, but when they dry out, they can almost look like they've been gold leafed. Anyway, they're definitely worth noting because, especially if you're eating mushrooms, because they're the ones that kill 90 to 95% of people who die of mushroom poisoning in California. So mistakes are made. And they do appear in our parks quite frequently, and people make mistakes. Another deadly mushroom that has pretty much the same toxins as the death cap is this tiny little mushroom. Looks kind of innocent. Gallerina marginata, deadly gallerina. Both of these pictures were taken from Huddard Park. They grow on wood. Some people have mistaken them for psilocybe containing mushrooms and have picked them and have eaten enough of them to die, but not very many people do that, fortunately. But these are quite common in Huddard and Wunderlich. Now, I've mentioned a couple of mycorrhizal mushrooms, with perhaps the most iconic is Cantharellus californicus, which is our chanterelle, our local, most common chanterelle in our area, which in the field often look like this, and are often called mud puppies because they come from fairly deep in the soil, and they're often just covered with mud. And they're kind of hard to see. They're barely emerging. They like our oaks most often. But they're really quite different from the dainty, small European chanterelles. A single specimen can weigh several pounds. Important for identifying these things is not only their size and what tree they grow under, but they don't really have true gills. They have blunt ridges with a lot of connections between the ridges. They don't have flat, sharp gills. Very important distinction. Another reason to mention this, and I've actually included a lemon for scale here, is that it's been nominated as California's state mushroom. There's only 4 states that have a state mushroom, and 2 of the other states that have a state mushroom are chanterelles. So I wasn't in favor of this one, but that's what's been nominated. And surely California should have a state mushroom. It's got a state rock, which is serpentine, as you may know.
George, I have a question from somebody on the chat.
Yeah.
And they'd like to know if we always have to pick a mushroom in order to be able to identify it.
Oh, that's a very good question. No. But in some cases, yes, because some are very easy to identify and some are, I mean, if you're talking about identify it to species, often you do. But I try not to, especially in parks, because I want people to enjoy the mushrooms and I want them to continue to create spores. So I carry around, it's a very nerdy thing, but I carry around a little mirror on the end of of an extendable, like a telescoping rod, so that I can look at the gills underneath the mushroom, which is, or the pores or whatever it is. So that's one way. And I take note of everything else. Also, if I do pull it out of the ground to identify it, because I'm not sure, I put it back. Because it's not dead, it's continuing to produce spores, and I just let it do what it's going to do. But there's some features, like on this mushroom here, which is the Manzanita bolete, which comes up under our madrones and is very characteristic, like the blue staining at the base. You're not going to get that without picking it up. And it has these, the stem has these dark spots, these scabers that are very characteristic. And you need to see that it has pores rather than something else. So yeah, in many cases, you can't identify it without taking it out, but in many other cases, you can, and with minimal disturbance. Here's another fairly iconic mushroom here. It's gone by various names over the years. Its current name is Rubroboletus eastwoodii, but it's California Satan bolete. And here it is. This is the same mushroom just sitting on top of the ground. It likes our oaks, like so many, our coast live oaks. But you pull it out of the ground and it's this giant rutabaga-like thing. It also stains very strongly. Its pores stain very strongly blue. And that's an important characteristic of this group of pored mushrooms. So, and this shape, the rutabaga turnip-like shape is very characteristic. And this is locally common, but doesn't spread too much beyond this area. Others that are iconic mycorrhizal species that exist in association with trees are Monterey pines, and other pines often have Amanita muscaria. Of course, it's the classic Disneyland toadstool mushroom. It's poisonous, though generally not fatal, and beautiful mushroom. And this Amanita calyptoderma, also known as cockera, which means cocoon in Italy, which is our closest equivalent to Caesar's mushroom, which is such a popular edible in Italy, which is why many people of Italian descent who moved to the Bay Area really like this mushroom. It's an edible Amanita, but with great caution. A number of people have died thinking that the mushroom they picked is this mushroom, whereas it's really the death cap. Especially since they like to pick it in the egg stage, which is why it's called a cocoon. Cockera is the Italian common term for their Caesar's mushroom. So in its eggs, very young stage, the entire mushroom is encased in this universal veil that looks like an egg. But the little young mushroom is inside of it. Even the hollow stem, because these mushrooms actually have hollow stems visible in here. People like to eat this stage, but that's the stage that's hardest to tell apart from the eggs of the similar eggs of the death cap. Another group, I'm not going to discuss them much individually, are the milk caps, very common in our area. This you can tell they're called milk caps because often the underside of their gills produce a sap or a milk that has a has a very characteristic color. Here's the yellow staining milk cap. The sap starts turning green in these. This one actually is rubrolacteus, and its sap is red colored when it's fresh, but then it soon turns green. And these sort of sickly green looking mushrooms are this same thing after they get a little bit dry. They may look sickly, but people love them, especially people from Russia and Spain. They pickle them. And then this group is related to the ones that are called candy caps. When dried, they smell like just like maple syrup. So there's a lot of variety and color in these, and these are all mycorrhizal mushrooms, thought to be anyway. Another major group are the russulas, which can be very pretty. Many of them are bright red and poisonous. They can be greens, yellows, pinks. This one, which is fragrantissima, looks like creme brulee, is remarkable for smelling very strongly of almonds, and then maraschino cherries, and then something awful. So you can often smell it. I've seen some that are so foul smelling I can't even get close, and others that are, when they're fresh and young, I smell them before I see them. So those are major groups. And then the coral mushrooms are also mycorrhizal, and we're losing some of them as we lose our tan oaks, because they're hosts for many of our tan oaks. Well, there are many different types of corals here. We do have quite a few, and some of them quite rare and becoming rarer. Then there's the lepiotas, which grow up under our redwoods often. This is actually from Huddard or off of Miramontes Trail, if I recall. The lepiotas, they often have a central spot. They're very attractive mushrooms. Some people call them dapperlings. They have a variety of woodland species that are, some of them are small and some of them are big. And I thought, for people who lead, if you guys are leading forays with kids and adults out there, it's very important to know the wood rotters, because there's so many of them, and they're often out when nothing else is out. And so I've used this as a technique often, because you got to talk about something, right? So, and there's plenty here. So there's many rotters of trees and of parts of trees. And especially now that so many of our trees are dying, our oaks and tan oaks. The two basic divisions of rotters, white rotters and brown rots, both of them are shown here. This is an example of white rot. This is brown rot. White rot, you know, what is a tree trunk made of? Well, two main parts are lignin, which is brown, and cellulose, which is white, and they're mixed together. But some fungi specialize in removing lignin, so they're the white rotters. Because once you get rid of the brown stuff, you're left with white, you're left with cellulose, and others specialize in digesting cellulose, in which case you end up with a much browner rot. And you see a lot of Douglas firs, especially with brown sort of cubes of brown rot lying on the ground. A couple of mushrooms that are associated with, I put one here. I don't really know what this mushroom is eating, but it's very tightly associated with redwood duff. So it's capable of digesting what redwoods drop onto the ground. I don't know if it's mycorrhizal or not, but it's very characteristic of our area because of redwoods. And it has a very long root. Look, you see this? Above ground, it has often an umbo or a nipple, and if it's very close to the ground, you'd never guess that it has a root or a rootlet, something that's like a root, a rhizomorph. See, this is cauloryza, meaning root. That's 1.5 feet long in this case, about. I've pointed the arrow down there. I don't even think the photograph captured all of it. They're really remarkable and quite common, and certainly iconic in our area. And then a prominent pathogen are honey mushrooms. There are several species. They're quite common here, but they are pathogens. And it's not good news when a tree is infected with a honey mushroom. Because they've become famous of late because some of them can occupy like 100 acres or so and can be thousands of years old, spreading through a forest. But foresters don't like them because they kill trees. Here's another tree killer that's quite common around it. It particularly is partial to our Douglas firs. Phaeolus swernitzi, otherwise known as a dye polypore, because it makes a lovely set of dyes. It's when it's fresh. And here I've shown you its many different looks. This is when it's first growing out. This is when it has fresh growing borders. Still has a little hint of a border here. And this is when it's old and finished fruiting. And it will persist for a couple years in this state, even though it's no longer producing spores. You'll often see it causes a butt rot of the trees it infects. Sometimes it's on trees, but more often it's right at the base of them, the fruiting body that is. But it's very, very bad for the trees that have it. This is another common wood rotter, very common actually, Fuscoporia gilva, the mustard yellow polypore. It can be a beautiful mushroom, but it loves our oaks, especially after they're already dead. And you will see this very commonly. Our sulfur tufts, you can't not have seen this. I mean, this is everywhere. Prominent feature is it's yellowish, tightly clustered. And then if you do turn this one over, it's usually growing out of wood, although sometimes it's buried wood, like roots. So it only seems to be terrestrial, but it has greenish yellow gills, a greenish tint to its gills. Very characteristic and common, and poisonous. Others, like this Strobilurus, specialize in cones, in pine cones. This one specializes in Douglas fir cones. I think this came from Philoli, if I remember. But you know, you'll see them in the right season. It's always fun to find them. And apparently it's pretty specific for cones. I mean, why it likes cones, what it gets out of them, I don't know. And for Douglas fir cones, it may do a couple of other cones, but in our area, it's always Douglas fir. Then, of course, there's the jack-o'-lantern. All of you have seen this. Always growing on wood, even if it's buried wood. Can throw a bunch of different looks at you. To me, it looks very distinct, but it has been mistaken for chanterelles, which our chanterelles don't grow on wood. And it has very sharp, classic gills, not the blunt ridges of a chanterelle. It's very poisonous. And when fresh, it will glow in the dark, which is fun to see. You have to, dark adapt yourself and put yourself in a closet, but it works. Here's the western deer mushroom, often growing right out of a rotting log. Quite robust, sometimes shiny, very common. And then there's several mushrooms that specialize in decaying leaves. This one we see quite a bit. This is a coast live oak leaf. So it's a gymnopus species, and there's several of these, but always fun to see these. They're very tiny, hair-like mushrooms. Why it's helpful to carry a hand lens around to see these things. And also, and this is true last year and the year before, sorry, there were many of our madrones had little tiny mushrooms growing off the bark. And it's not clear that there's anything bad about this. And some years you see them and some years you don't. But they're just thousands of them. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the tree. But many of these apparently are specific to madrones. This one might be Messina madronicola, or it might not be. It's very hard to tell them apart. I call them mycenoid because the Mycena group, many of them are very small and they tend to look alike. And so this would be a case where you're looking at the substrate of the mushroom to try to get a sense of what it might be. And in this case, I don't know. I'd probably send it off for sequencing or something if I really wanted to know. And then here's another one that I'm bringing up this year because I saw it more this year than I ever have. Tuberia punicea, which apparently is 100% specific for dying or even well-rotted madrones. So it's found only really in areas where madrones are found, and of course we have them. Beautiful little red mushroom. And then, and it is a rotter, but it's an exception among other rotters in being highly specific to a particular tree. And then here's like, I've just grouped these together because they're black wood rotters. And seen a lot of this one on the right, the black jelly roll, Exidia granulosa, which is really actually quite interesting. It usually is on decorticated, which is barkless tree, but sometimes it grows through the bark. It's really squishy, but when it dries out, it turns into like a spot, looks like somebody painted it with tar. And then when it rains again, it springs right back. So it has this revivification property, which is really quite remarkable. This one really are like gummy bears. They're called black jelly drops, Bulgaria inquinans. It's very common on our dead tan oaks, actually, that are dying. Very interesting looking mushroom, but it's quite a different texture from this. And then these carbon balls are, I'm sure you've seen them thousands of times because they're usually on our coast live oaks, sometimes on our tan oaks. They are like charcoal briquettes. They're just really hard. The story here, the interesting story here is that this organism apparently infects the tree when it's very young, but it doesn't fruit, and it can be there inside the tree for decades, many decades. It doesn't fruit until the tree dies. There's some other mushrooms like this. It's not known if it plays a role in death, but we're seeing an awful lot of this in trees killed by sudden oak death. Some people call it a cramp ball. It has a similar fungus that affects trees in England. It's called King Alfred's cakes. But it's a different genus and species, so I don't like to use that term. I hope you've seen these. I've seen these many times in Huddard and nearby. Beautiful mushrooms. These comb tooths, these are hericiums, Hericium coralloides. They like our oaks, our hardwoods. And they are a toothed mushroom, very closely related to this lion's mane, which were now cultivated and available in stores. But this one was in the watershed, I believe, growing off of an oak. So we have our own lion's mane here growing wild. Another tooth mushroom. It looks a little bit like a thistle or an artichoke or something, but it's a fungus that likes oaks, hardwoods. And this mushroom is worth knowing, not only because it's big and it's beautiful, this chicken of the woods, our version of chicken of the woods. This one is Latiparus gilbertsonii, which is growing on black oak. It's a pathogenic mushroom, so it will weaken a tree and may kill it. It's an edible mushroom, so some people like it. But a different version, we think, or possibly it's the same species, will grow on our eucalyptus trees too. So we see this quite a bit, but its season, it usually fruits, this is its claim to fame, it usually fruits before the first rains. So it comes out early. And the fruit bodies tend to be persistent, but they turned into something looked like decomposed wallboard at some point. And I hope you guys have seen this at various points. It used to be a somewhat mysterious mushroom. Some people just called it purple fuzz, but now it has a name. And it likes our dead oaks. And it's often lurking under the bark. And one interesting feature, and I don't know if you can see it on this slide, I should have blown it up more, is it tends to leak a reddish fluid. There's a process called guttation, and a number of fungi do this. They're shedding fluid, maybe because they have too much. It's not really clear why they do it, but it's a characteristic thing, and very colorful. And it
So
likes our,
speaking
yes.
of that comment about it being colorful, someone wants to know, why are colors so vivid on mushrooms / fungus?
Boy, that's a really good question. And I've been asked that before, and I don't know the answer. Some people believe that in some cases it's to make themselves attractive to something that might eat them, because some mushrooms actually benefit from being eaten and having their spores pass through the digestive system of some animal who then wanders away some other, further away. In other cases, it may be the opposite. Their colors may be providing some kind of warning. In still other cases, the coloring may be, and this is definitely true of some of the melanins that are produced, same in skin pigments in humans. It's meant as a sunscreen, right? Protection from UV radiation or drying. So those are some of the reasons why a fungus would be purple. I can't tell you.
Thank you. While I have you distracted, a couple of other questions.
By the way, I can't see the chat since
Yeah.
I'm sharing the screen. So
Yeah.
you,
No,
you'll
that's
have
fine.
to you have to tell me.
Yeah. So Amy asks, can a coast live oak have carbon balls and still live a long life?
I have seen carbon balls on living oaks, but on a dying portion of it.
Okay.
So in general, it's definitely not a sign of health. And as I mentioned, they seem to mostly wait for a tree to die, possibly of other causes. Having the fungus having been present and living within the tree for a long, long time.
Interesting. And then the final question that I have here is, are mushrooms giving a ranking for rarity?
Well, some places do that. There is a red designation for certain really rare fungi. You can also just get a sense of how uncommon they are by going to a website like iNaturalist and typing in the name of your favorite fungus to find out how often it's been spotted. I find that to be very helpful. Sometimes they're misidentified, but but it does give you a sense of where they are and how many times they've been cited. Plus texts, the really useful texts around here, like the ones by Dennis Desjardins and Christian Schwartz and Noah Siegel. Let's really focus on our area and are excellent. Will tell you whether it's common or rare or just never seen below Sonoma County or something like that. So if you do find it there or you think you found it, you better be, you better take special care. Plus, if you find a really rare fungus, well, that's the problem. How do you identify a real fungus without disturbing it, at least some? But you don't really want to disturb a really rare fungus, right? Some of them are so common. In general, most mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of an underground mycelium, and you don't disturb the mycelium by picking the fungus. But they still would not be able to produce spores if you carried it away. So I generally leave it in place. I'll show you an example of a really rare fungus. I think I've got one.
Great.
Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. And here's another little wood rotter that you often, you just go right by, but it's a little asco. It's a cup fungus, tiny cup fungus, and it has little border of things that look like eyelashes on it. It likes dead oaks and other trees. It's cute. But by far the most common rotter, at least at certain times of the year, is Asterium. Generally with yellowish overtones. We call it a false turkey tail. Many people think that it's a turkey tail, but it's not. It's different because it doesn't have pores. Also has different colors. A little bit of hair on it, as you can see from the blow up. Sometimes it's just totally covering branches. But one interesting feature of it is that Asterium is the host for witch's butter, which is always a treat for people on forays. And the witch's butter is eating the Asterium, not the wood. So it's not the witch's butter that's the wood rotter, it's the Asterium. So it's a parasite on Asterium. So here's an example of actually witch's butter growing on Asterium. But you don't always see the Asterium because it might be parasitizing the mycelium that's buried in the wood and that hasn't fruited yet. Here's true turkey tails, which are less common than Asterium, but they have pores. And actually, I submitted this photograph to iNaturalist, and iNaturalist thought it was a turkey. That's it. That was its ID, a real turkey. But they're very colorful and they have many different arrangements, shelf-like arrangements. There is a closely related, so you notice that this is Trametes versicolor. There's a very closely related species called the gilled polypore, also a Trametes, same genus, but it has gills rather than pores. And so, it doesn't take much to convert from your pore generating structure from pores to gills and back again. This is an example of convergent evolution if you're talking about a pored mushroom moving towards gilled mushroom. But otherwise, from the top, it looks a lot like a turkey tail with all those bands. And another feature of this particular gilled polypore, which is very common in Huddard Park and Wunderlich and in Edgewood, is that it often has algae growing on it. So it's green. The mushroom is not green. It's just that it's hosting algae. Whether it's getting any benefit from the algae or just can't fend it off, I don't think is known at this point, but it would be interesting to know. Because if it was getting some benefit from algae, it would be something like a lichen, or, some resemblance. And of course, we've already mentioned oysters, but there were so many oysters this year in Huddart and Wunderlich. Almost most of them hosted on our downed live oaks. You know, they grow on dead wood mainly, although sometimes you'll see them on dead, dying parts of still living oaks. Very abundant, but just not everything that looks like this, that grows shelf-like on a dying tree is an oyster. So my colleagues talk about pleurotoid mushrooms. This is pleurotus, so pleurotoid mushrooms, things that look like oysters but aren't. And there's several that are common that are worth mentioning. One of them is the orange mock oyster, Phylotopsis nigellans, notable for a couple of reasons. Well, first, it's very orange, so it's very different from your regular oyster mushroom. Also, it often smells a little bit like swamp gas, though just as often it doesn't. I don't really pick up much of a smell. Here's a view of the underside. The gills are very sharp, close, and in multiple generations. Has many short gills. Here's one gill, ends there. Here's another gill, ends there. Here's another gill, ends there. Here's another. You're counting the generations of gills is one way to speciate mushrooms, believe it or not. Anyway, doesn't look much like an oyster, but it's common around here. These are, I promise you, rare mushrooms. These are rare, very, very rare. This one was actually at Filoli, and this one was up just west of Huddart, up off of the trail, the Bay Area Ridge Trail. Hohenbuehelia. They have a layer of gelatin underneath their caps. Anyway, very rare. It's only been found a couple of times. The world's expert on these mushrooms has weighed in on this mushroom I found. So every once in a while, you find things that you can't explain. Keep an open mind. Another fairly common mushroom, not as that's pleurotoid, but looks obviously quite different in color, sort of hairy on the top. Looks like a claw. Anyway, bear's paw. Lentinellus. There's several types of those. And some that are very dainty and grow just on the end of twigs, like this marasmiellus. But very different from an oyster. Thought I'd at least mention wood chips, because there's an amazing amount of wood chips being created seemingly every day in Huddart and Wunderlich, because they chew up dead trees and clear away debris. Anyway, they're a good source of mushrooms, and they're typical mushrooms that grow in wood chips. This one that there's a lot of right now, so I mentioned it. There's a Grossope, the Springfield cap. Big, robust yellow caps that get cracked in age, though. They stay around for quite a long time, and when they dry, they crack quite attractively. Have dark colored spores. And here you can see it, just the mycelia attached to the chips. But in contrast, it's a very ephemeral species, but very common. The rabbit's foot inky cap, the inky caps are a group that tend to dissolve, auto-digest. But this one often will grow and disappear in one day, and most typically out of wood chips. And often all you will find are these little stalks sitting up because the cap has dissolved itself, has turned into ink. Nonetheless, they're very attractive little mushrooms, very fragile, hard to collect. You often see these tightly clustered mica cap inkies in Huddart and Wunderlich, often growing on wood, buried wood, and then the shaggy mane, so characteristic, turning into ink. It's another inky cap, turning into ink at its base. And I took this one as a couple of his partners, and and showed you how it's turning into ink. It autodigests in the mycological nomenclature, it deliquesces. And apparently the spores are in the drippy stuff that comes off of it. People have used this as ink. In fact, the illustrations in that Entangled Life book by what's his name? Merwin Sheldrake. The illustrations are all drawn in inky, shaggy mane ink. Anyway, it's a peculiar habit, and I don't know if we fully understand why it does that. There are some inky caps that don't do it, but that one definitely does. Tuberia, very common in wood chips, especially in the meadow area in Huddard. You can see the little mycelia hanging off of it, those tiny little hairy threads. It's got a sort of a flattened, ridged, little remnants of the veil on the edge. Anyway, quite common. And then, of course, everyone has seen Stropharia in Huddard. I mean, it's just there. It's a lovely, large, trooping mushroom that's just so common there in disturbed areas. Has little bits of veil, of the partial veil hanging off the edges like icicles. And then also shaggy stems, just beautiful mushroom. And then that was a big mushroom. This is a tiny mushroom. You gotta get close to the ground to see this. So this is a white bird's nest. So I see them quite often, but you have to look for them, right? But they're often in wood chips and in disturbed areas. So the take-home point here for this is an ascomycete. It's a variation on a cup fungus, but they use raindrops as a strategy for distributing the spores. The raindrops land in the cups and splash out these little, this isn't an individual spore, it's a spore capsule. So you can see some of the spores that have already come out lying around. So an interesting strategy. And then Clathrus, this red cage stinkhorn. This is the only stinkhorn I'm showing here, I believe. But it's a beautiful mushroom that almost confined to wood chips, in this case, eucalyptus. It's often seen in eucalyptus chip. In fact, it's thought to be an import from Australia. So it would be, yeah, an exotic species, came over on mulch or something like that. And then the earth stars also grow in disturbed areas. This one often, this is a reasonably fresh one. They distribute their spores, kind of like puffballs. They distribute their spores either by being splashed out or stepped on. But the tough part here on the edges persists for over a year. And you'll often see them lying around, and kids like them. They throw them like ninja weapons or something. But they also, it's called the barometer earth star because when they get dry, the edges curl up, and when they get wet, they flatten out. You can tell how dry it is. It's got Astrius hygrometricus. So you're measuring water content. All right, I'm just gonna wrap up here with things that aren't fungi. Okay, so I'm sure all of you have seen these in the woods. I actually got a call about this once from Woodside Elementary School because a great number of these came up at one time, and they were scared that something very bad was happening. But these are slime molds. These are not fungi. They're not mushrooms. They're not fungi. They're really amoeba-like organisms that at a stage, they're free-living, single-celled organisms for much of their life cycle. But at some point, especially when it starts to dry out and they're running out of food, they start to aggregate. And they crawl all over things. This particular example is insect egg slime. You can see it crawling over logs or twigs, up branches, and it ends up with eggs on, this is like, it ends up on a fern, but it could be anything. And here's I'm just showing you the end result of something that I followed over time growing near my house. These are very interesting organisms and they're always cause some excitement when you see them. Here's dog vomit or scrambled egg slime, obviously scores high on the ick factor, but another species of slime mold. And also very common wolf's milk or toothpaste slime. If you push one of these little buttons, and they could, initially they're often pink and then they turn gray or brown. You push them, then this toothpaste-like material comes out. Another slime mold. Salmon egg slime mold. This is tapioca slime. Aptly named, I think. It sort of looks like it could be a mushroom, but then if you follow it, it has a very different life scale. So with that, I think I will end. And
Well, we got
entertain
a couple of questions for you on that last point. Someone wants to know, are all slimes decomposers?
Well, they're not decomposers like fungi are, like many fungi are. They're more like amoebas. They're engulfers. Whereas remember, fungi aren't. Fungi secrete enzymes which digest the material outside of themselves. These things are like amoebas you learn about in school. They surround bacteria, fungi, whatever they can get. They don't really eat wood very much, to my knowledge. They're mainly eating other organisms, and they surround them and then digest them inside of organelles. But when they are moving, like I showed here, like there or there, they're not single-celled creatures. In fact, they're one giant plasmodium. They don't have cell walls. So they just swarm, and that they still eat as they go. And in fact, they're constantly probing, and when a source of food like bacteria or a set of fungi or something is found, then they reorient their paths. This has been much studied. It's been published in Nature and Science, them solving complex mathematical problems that involve, finding the shortest route between cities and things like this. They're very good at distributing resources and finding and distributing resources, but they act as a single cell at that point because they have no cell walls, many nuclei within a single mass. That's why they're called slimes.
Interesting.
But yeah, completely different lifestyle compared to fungi.
So somebody wants to know, when they're taking a photo of a fungus and they want to identify it on iNaturalist, what elements do you need to take a photo of? Are there certain angles that are most advantageous? Is the habitat or what it's growing on advantageous? Do you have any tips for that? Well,
yeah, I would say the more, as you might know, for iNaturalist, you can provide more than one photograph for a given sighting. And yeah, I usually provide a picture of the top. I often try to provide a picture of what it's growing under, or write a note saying, this is under coast live oak or something like that. Or what is it growing on, you know, what kind of tree? And then definitely you need a picture of the gild or what, you know, of the underside, whether it's gills or pores or teeth or whatever it is. And then for some, you would need to, I mean, if you, to get the species, and actually quite often you can't get the species, but you slice it just to reveal staining reactions of the color of the flesh in the cap and in the stem. Is the stem hollow? You don't know that without cutting it. And many mushrooms stain only at the base, and also the base may be connected to some bits of a mycelium that may have a color to it or a particular pattern and may crawl a certain amount of the way up the base. You need a good picture of the stem if it's a stemmed mushroom, because the stems have many characteristics, you know, scabers and dots and colors and clefts and this and that. So, so what am I saying? The more, the better. You're more likely to get to species the more you take a picture of.
Great. And Kathy wants to know, do King Alfred's cakes also occur in our area, or do we only have carbon balls?
Well, we have another thing called Daldinia, which is much less common. But the thing that's called King Alfred's cakes in the UK, we don't have here. But there are other forms, but by far, because of our coast live oak, their preference for coast live oak, and because so many are dying, that's what we're seeing here.
And another question is, what causes the colored stripes on the turkey tails? Do you have any idea?
Boy, I don't know. And they're variable too. But the thing is, when you see the turkey tails on a given log, they pretty much have the same pattern, right? Each individual, each fruiting body. I don't know what that tells you. It still could be genes versus environment, you know. I don't know. It could be that the substrate helps to determine, or the weather, changes in rainfall or weather, or it could be that there are different varieties, genetically different varieties that determine what the color variation is going to be. Remember that turkey tails do sexually reproduce, and the fruiting bodies are producing, you know, they are the result of generally two different sexes, you know, compatible, both being turkey tails, but different mating types coming together. And so it could be that there are different varieties. They also sometimes oppose each other. Turkey tails are sometimes deliberately introduced to wood by woodworkers to create the spalting, those lines that people who've turned bowls and things really love. And where the two types meet, they often form a colored line. So I don't know. To me, it's a mystery.
Okay, and the last question is probably the hardest of all. What's your favorite edible mushroom?
That is extremely difficult. I do like a lot of them. Around here, geez. I would I love hericiums, which are the comb tooths. And not everyone likes them, but I think they're lovely.
Great. All right. Well, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask any questions or make any comments, you're welcome to do that now. Otherwise, we'll say goodnight. But I think this has been an incredibly useful discussion and so much information. I'm going to have to rewatch this one a few times, I think, to digest everything. Does anybody have anything? Mike, did you want to say something?
No, it was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it.
And you're getting a lot of shout outs and claps, George, from people responding. So wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. And the Friends of Huddart and Wunderlich has a couple of upcoming webinars that we hope you'll join us for. And I know you all probably got an email about the Pollinator Posse, which is coming in May. That's going to be a really cool event that we hope our friends at Edgewood will join us for. So thank you everyone and good night. And thank you, George, so much. This was awesome.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.